Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. Today we are talking with Daniel Mahoney, the Augustine Chair and Distinguished Scholarship at Assumption College, about his new book, The Idol of Our Age. Daniel Mahoney is the author of numerous books, including The Other Solzhenitsyn and Conservative Foundations of the Liberal Order. Daniel Mahoney, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Richard. My pleasure.
So this book is The Idol of Our Age, How the Religion of Humanity Subverts Christianity. So you're talking about humanitarianism. Most people think about humanitarianism. They think it's generally a good thing, help the poor, help those around the globe who are the victims of various circumstances, whether that be disasters or wars or famines or things like that. It's about uplift and helping people. It's sort of a secularized Christian ethic, things like that. And so, and it's better. It's better than, say, the alternatives that are out there, which we know of. And so, but you have written a book that is a blistering critique of humanitarianism. Tell us what you think the humanitarian ethos is.
Yeah, my book is not a critique of the Good Samaritan or people doing good work or Doctors Without Borders or anything of the sort. I mean, I think fellow feeling, help for the poor, a philanthropic impulse, all of those things are not only required by the gospel, but are a fundamental part of what it means to be a human being. But by humanitarianism, and specifically the phrase, the religion of humanity, I mean something quite distinct, not absolutely unrelated, but quite distinct. And that is a view that, and it entails what the great French thinker Alain Besançon calls a falsification of the good, where virtue is reduced to an effort to transform the human condition on earth, where various projects aimed at egalitarian social justice exhaust the meaning of the Good Samaritan or the Gospel's call for us to love our neighbor, where politics focuses more and more on a kind of vague, mushy cosmopolitanism that forgets the arduous demands of the political common good in each political community. And, of course, the term religion of humanity, which is a starker term, goes back to the 19th century, to Auguste Comte, and to the later John Stuart Mill. And it refers to a self-conscious intellectual and moral project to eliminate God and establish a wholly atheistic humanism or humanitarianism. And I think the humanitarian ethos in the end, at its deepest level and its most thought-out level, entails a kind of self-deification of man and an utter valorization of the terrestrial experience of human beings. So instead of human beings being temporal and eternal, belonging to this earth, but also having a transcendental destiny, what it means to be a human is reduced to a simply temporal sphere, and that is reduced to a very aggressive, leftist, humanitarian ethos that isn't satisfied with the human condition as it is, but aims at initiating a broadly utopian vision of human perfection on earth. So, I knew when I used the term humanitarianism that it might be misunderstood. I gave a talk at Furman University a few years ago, and the students all seemed to think I was arguing against loving one's neighbor.
Yeah.
So that was of course a radical and fundamental misunderstanding of my argument.
Now,
I hope I clarified all that.
No, I know, and I think so. Humanitarianism doesn't ignore, say, a religious nature of man. you're saying, but it collapses it. It draws it down into a very imminent, mundane, say, to worldly focus of various forms of attempts to make so-called improve life for human beings. So it's an attempt. It's sort of channeling that into a very time limited focus of the here
Well,
and the now and
that's
what
absolutely
can we
right.
do. Yeah. So why? Let me think about what do you see as the negative consequences of that? Because I think a lot of if we were talking to a apostle of humanitarianism, I think they would say, well, we started this because the alternatives were much worse.
Well,
National pride, religious aggressiveness leads to all sorts of violence, to killing. There's history of man demonstrates all this. What's the problem
well,
here?
G.K. Chesterton once said, in reference to Contempt for the Nation, we don't get rid of marriage because some people abuse it, and we don't reject love because it takes pathological forms. All human goods take pathological forms, and the task of the moral virtues and the intellectual virtues is to guide human conduct individually and collectively in a direction that maintains the integrity of common life and the integrity of the virtues. So, look, no, humanitarianism is much worse than when it replaces, because, first of all, a particular political community mediates universal goods. It's the place where humanity comes to sight. It's only in a particular place that we learn to love others, to appreciate our duties, to have a sense of the political common good, et cetera, et cetera. A vague and abstract conception of humanity not only weakens the concreteness of the virtues and of our obligations to our neighbors and our fellow countrymen and ultimately to humanity itself, but it also it also can lead to a new and dangerous fanaticism where the perfection of humanity with a capital H becomes this goal that is completely divorced from real and concrete human ends and from a sense of the possible, a sense of limits. So, Auguste Comte, who was the founder of the religion of humanity, he was a famous philosopher, social scientist in early and middle 19th century of France. He initially was a proponent and theoretician of social science positivism, but in the end, Comte decided that human beings are religious beings, and there has to be a grand être, a great being, a supreme being. But Comte said the supreme being is man, and so that involves, as your remark suggested, a complete immanentization of the horizon of greatness or excellence. So there's nothing above man except the highest in man. And I think that my book is inspired and moved by a deep concern that many of my contemporary co-religionists, not just Roman Catholics, but other Christians and believers in theistic religion, more and more conflate biblical religion or theistic understanding of God with a humanitarian ethos and impulse. So essentially the church becomes a NGO. Essentially the task is to ameliorate the human condition. And often to do so in a very thoughtless, aggressive, ideological way. Hence liberationism, hence a certain indulgence for left-wing tyrannies in the third world, hence a downplaying of the arduous moral virtues, especially when it comes to sexual morality. So one, I think the religion of humanity is a terrible and corrupting replacement for authentic or transcendental religion. But secondly, I see the Christian religion being subverted from within by people who are at best half humanitarians and in many cases simply lose any real concern for the transcendental aims and goals of authentic religion.
Now, let me ask you, listening to that critique and the ways that humanitarianism interacts with Christianity. I mean, another idea I know you're conversing with is humanitarianism really comes out of Christianity. It's in some ways a product of Christianity. And then in certain ways, I think that's a view Leo Strauss, you can see him taking, and Eric Voegelin, that you really can understand this sort of emancipationist idea and the improvement of man, the constant improvement of man without sort of this Christian idea of salvation to begin with. What do you say to that?
Well, I think there's a good deal of truth to that. I think I think it's very easy for the commandment to love our neighbor to be transformed into a vague notion of fellow feeling. I remember the wonderful interview that Malcolm Muggeridge, the British journalist who converted to Catholicism at the end of his life, did in 1969 with Mother Teresa, now Saint Mother Teresa of Calcutta. And he asked her, why does she do what she does? And it's very easy to think of Mother Teresa as some kind of a good deed doer or humanitarian. And she said, I want to do something beautiful for God. And even love of neighbor, the love of neighbor that Christ commands in Scripture, is never simply on a horizontal plane. It always is an elevation of the soul toward God. That doesn't mean we don't love real people and they're just instruments for the love of God, but it means that love of neighbor is never simply an end in itself from a biblical or Christian point of view.
Yeah.
And I think love of humanitarianism. Think of the word humanity with a capital H. The communist newspaper in Paris is called L'Humanité, right? All the terrible ideological movements of the 20th century were believers in humanity with a capital H. This abstraction of a transfigured humanity that was willing to do terrible things to real human beings in order to achieve the unachievable. And of course, I would say all forms of humanitarianism, from the most mild progressivism in the West to full-scale totalitarianism, as Solzhenitsyn, among others, said. I think Orestes Brownson saw this too. They have no real sense of the scissors, the moral scissors in the human soul.
Yeah.
Or what I like to call the enduring, the sempiternal drama of good and evil in the human soul, which will never go away short of the second coming and the consummation of the kingdom.
Thinking about, you introduce and discuss the ideas of a number of thinkers around their critiques of humanitarianism. One of them you just mentioned, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. So Solzhenitsyn actually gives us a way to think about what you were just describing, maybe, and maybe it's this idea of no enemies to the left, and that sort of a well-intended, benevolent, we'll say, liberal, progressive humanitarianism you see in liberal democracies over the decades or many of its members have struggled to understand or see tyranny within communist states or socialist states. Is this why? Is this an explanation for maybe why that is the case? This sort of the humanitarianism reducing, making it difficult to distinguish motives from intentions and consequences of political outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's exactly on mark. There's a chapter in the First Circle, chapter 59, Buddha's Smile, which I don't talk about in this book.
No, tell us what the First Circle is briefly.
The First Circle was Solzhenitsyn's great book about years he spent at a scientific research prison in the Gulag in the late 1940s, and it's a very conversational. But anyway, there's a chapter called Buddha's Smile about the visit of an American politician's wife, Mrs. R. It's clearly Eleanor Roosevelt in the final published version of the book. And she comes and she's taken in by this Potemkin village, this staged showing of the prisoners, all well fed, no lice, haircut, holding copies of the Talmud and the Bible and the Koran, with a statue of Buddha smiling in the corner. Rightly so, given the fact that this is a completely staged presentation. But there was something in Mrs. Roosevelt, a softness, a liberalism, and a humanitarianism that got in the way of her appreciating the hard side of humanitarianism, or the totalitarian side of a certain kind of totalitarian secularism. So she saw no enemies to the right. She could only see
To the left.
another movement that cared for the poor, that was working for penal justice, that was attempting to ameliorate the human condition. This has always been the problem with soft utopianism or soft humanitarianism. Ronald Niebuhr said years ago, it always gives way to a more consistent, more materialistic, more atheistic, more violent, hard humanitarianism. Just one more thing about Solzhenitsyn. I concentrate a lot on his treatment in The Red Wheel, his great cycle of books about the coming of war and revolution in Russia, on his critique of Leo Tolstoy. Leo Tolstoy is what many humanitarians would see as a true Christian today. He was against all war, all violence. He wanted to help the poor. He wanted to get rid of the sacraments, the cross. He wanted the effectual truth of Christianity. But Solzhenitsyn argued that given the importance of the state as an instrument for protecting and sustaining the common good, given the reality of evil in men's souls and in certain political movements and regimes, that absolute non-resistance to evil was an abandonment of our concrete obligations to charity and the common good. So Solzhenitsyn thought evil had to be resisted. He criticizes Tsar Nicholas II for doing nothing to stop revolution in 1917. He endorses what he calls an active struggle against evil that was well embodied in his multi-decade struggle against Solzhenitsyn's multi-decade struggle against totalitarianism. So Solzhenitsyn really provides us with a different vision of the human and political consequences of Christianity that are quite opposed to humanitarianism. His predecessor, Vladimir Soloviev, who I talk about in his 3 conversations on war, progress, and the good and the end of history, says explicitly, there can be a good war and an evil peace. By the way, that sentence, think about it.
Yeah.
Today, 99% of the progressives in the church, 99% or more of the humanitarians would vehemently deny, as Pope Francis recently did in a new book called Politics and Society, an interview with Dominique Walton. He explicitly denies that there can ever be a good war and that all peace is just. And from Solzhenitsyn's or Soloviev's point of view, that is not the teaching of the gospel. That is the teaching of the modern religion of humanity.
Thinking about humanitarianism and politics, and maybe a contemporary observation, Pierre Menant writes the foreword for this book. He's a great French thinker, one of our best thinkers on the nation state, what it means, why it's good, why it should be defended, and a really tough critic of the European Union. And as you know, he's argued in any number of books and essays that the ethos, to the extent there is one, of the European Union is a humanitarianism. Your thoughts on that idea and how that shapes the way the European Union chooses to govern itself?
Yeah, Pierre Menant has some sympathy. He doesn't think it's likely or advisable, but he has some sympathy for an impulse that would encourage Europe to build a greater common good, a United States of Europe that could think and act politically in the world. But in the end, he sees an opposite process at work. The European Union has extended the field of what he calls culture and civilization, but at the same time has weakened the internal resources available to each political community and nation state. So, to use a shorthand, Pierre Menard sometimes speaks about post 1968 Europe as being marked by two broad processes: one of depoliticization that undermines collective virtue, that undermines the capacity to think and act politically in the world, to be meaningful actors on the world stage, and the second is the de-Christianization of Europe. So Europe, without putting anything plausible in the place of the old nations, has succeeded in weakening and encouraging, if not the withering away, at least the loss of strength of the old nations and, of course, the old religion, the Christian religion of Europe. So, and yes, Menard's view is Europe does have a religion, a secular religion, and that secular religion is precisely the religion of humanity. And this religion of humanity is tied to a radical and imprudent understanding of the rights of man, where human rights, which are salutary within their own limited sphere, become the alpha and omega of humanity. There are no limits to rights. New ones are invented every hour. And without a political framework of law, of custom, of continuity, of tradition, this excessive valorization of rights undermines the integrity of a political community and even of the moral life. So Menard says, for example, in his last book on natural law, we suffer, in this case Europeans, but we too in America, from what he calls the tyranny of the explicit, as ideas or projects or choices that ought to be subject to debate and deliberation become absolute rights. There is a subsequent undermining of both politics and the politics of prudence. And so for Menard, I get a little far afield, but natural law goes hand in hand with practical reason, which goes hand in hand with political self-government. And so this religion of humanity just puts an end to all the questions, including political deliberation, because we know that there are no limits to ever newly discovered rights, ever more egalitarianism, ever more aggressively defined social justice. There are no open questions.
Yeah.
These are the goals, and they have to be applied in a unilateral and aggressive and absolute way as possible.
No, sort of like fulfilling what Manon is saying about humanitarianism and the way it dominates the politics of Europe is the great European intellectual man of the left, Jürgen Habermas, who you also write about in your book, and his attempt to really sort of constitutionally enshrine this vision in the European Union.
Yeah, I mean, Habermas is a very revealing intellectual. As I say in my little chapter on him, there are certainly worse figures in Europe today, much worse. Zizek and Badiou, who are defenders of the idea of communism and write books. Zizek's book, A Defense of Lost Causes, celebrating Robespierre, Stalin, Mao, the Cultural Revolution. Badiou does more or less the same thing. Habermas isn't that. But he's a little soft on communism. He's very clear that Nazism was intrinsically evil, and he, without being pro-communist, had a certain indulgence toward communism as at least being a movement on the left and therefore committed to certain desirable goals. But as you're alluding to, he's most famous for his idea of constitutional patriotism, which is an understanding of patriotism that would denude patriotism from anything that wasn't institutional, tradition, shared inheritances, language, collective memory. So it's a kind of patriotism that a modern left progressive could like, because it's very limiting, and it tears down any authentic connection to the past, a past which Habermas no doubt associates with bellicosity and injustice and inegalitarianism. And in recent works, Habermas has written about the need for a world community, world sovereignty. So he sees the EU as the avant-garde of humanity, pointing toward a more comprehensive and complete cosmopolitanism.
It's interesting.
It's easy to say this is utopian, which is it is, but it's also undesirable. Very struck in one of Habermas's recent books that I talk about in the book. He speaks explicitly of the religion of humanity. That's his religion. Well, to bind this world community together is the religion of humanity. Just one other thing about Habermas. Habermas, though, is one of the few proponents of the religion of humanity who knows that this idea of universal dignity of man is dialectically dependent on Christianity. It doesn't have intrinsic spiritual resources of its own. That's why he tends to be friendlier to Christianity than some other humanitarians.
Thinking about, Habermas, one of the things you mentioned in your essay is he never really deals with foreign policy. I mean, that's something that stuck out to me, that these sort of hard realities of politics are things he just doesn't even mention or seem to want to think about, at least in print. That seemed to me to, in a way, sort of a clue to what he's doing.
Oh, that I do mention that, and that's a good thing to pick up on. Yeah, I mean, if you think about foreign policy, the animosity between sovereign collectivities, the fact that even decent political communities have tensions between them, the fact that our principal loyalty has to be to the lived community that embodies the common good and not an abstract universal community, which in the end embodies nothing. Thinking about war would certainly bring to mind very quickly the limits of I think Pierre Menard is absolutely right in contrast to Habermas that, yes, there is a universal. Those of us who defend humane national loyalty are not denying the universal the way the Nazis did, pure particularity, lupine imperialism. But we're saying the universal is mediated in the concrete.
Yeah.
And given human imperfection, given evil, given the tensions inherent in collective life, there's going to be war. But by not thinking about war, Habermas, not writing about it, Habermas, or simply denouncing it, Habermas is able to evade a series of absolutely fundamental questions.
Yeah, no, exactly. Thinking just the humanitarianism and political consequences. So think about the on one hand, the decision by the German Chancellor Angela Merkel to admit over 1 million North Africans into Germany. Almost with sort of a wave of her hand and a sort of a general sentiment that we have to do this, not even really seeming to think politically about what that might mean, and what that might mean for the EU overall, given the Schengen Agreement and the fact that there are no borders within the European Union. And also, and Manon has pointed to this as well, the European Union having no real political criteria by which it would use to decide who should be in the union, or even who should be out of the union. That also seems to be a consequence, or kind of the type of politics you get with these sort of humanitarian ideals dominating your discussion.
Yes, absolutely. Pope Francis, who in these regards is a full-fledged secular humanitarian, as paradoxically as that sounds, in his speech to the European Parliament in 2014 said, "We can't let people drown in the Mediterranean," to which Pierre Menard responded, "No, as Christians and men of goodwill, we can't. But it doesn't mean we have an obligation to make these people citizens of our country, our countries." And this absence of any political criteria of judgment, how the influx of, and by the way, not mainly women and children, but young, raucous men in their 20s, admitted into this open zone of the European community, the consequences of that, humanly, in terms of safety, as we saw in Cologne on New Year's Eve a couple of years ago, in terms of um,
Yeah.
simply the European community, its integrity, its demographics. And by the way, it is a meaningful question. I mean, the European community wants to pretend that it is wholly secular. In its failed constitution, it simply bypassed 2,000 years of Christianity and Christendom. But as Menand argues, whether it likes it or not, it has a Christian mark, a Christian face. It's not merely a secular field of open civilization. And the so-called populace in the East, the civilizational parties, Fidesz in Hungary, Law and Justice in Poland, they know what's at stake. They want to protect the Christian character of Europe. But people like Merkel or Macron, who define Europe simply by openness and secularism, have no ground to resist a radical and complete cultural and demographic transformation that would in effect entail the end of European civilization. So it's not only Merkel's decision was not only imprudent, mindless, thoughtless, and anti-political, but it showed a sort of contempt for any idea that Europe has an interest in maintaining its soul or its integrity.
The decision also has, as you know, has produced any number of political consequences throughout European countries, including beginning the erosion of her power. This decision, which to me suggests the awareness or not only just the pushback, but I think it forced sort of a collective thinking of a lot of Europeans. Is this the direction we want to go in? And thinking about all of these critiques that have been made of the European Union, the so-called democratic deficit, things like this. If we allow this to happen, then we will become this, as you were describing, this type of a continent. And so you've seen the rise of these parties in various countries, some of which say things, do things that make, I think, all of us a little uncomfortable, but they're trying to recover a political, a certain politics for the country that's been ignored.
Yeah, there are two articles that are extremely helpful. My book's helpful on this too, but there's an article by Pierre Menand that appeared in French and was translated into American Affairs called on Populism and the Fanaticism of the Center, making the very simple point that it's the fanaticism of the centrist parties, the refusal to think seriously about immigration, borders, Islam, etc., that has led to the rise of a populism that is sometimes undisciplined and raucous. But if the centrist parties on the center right and center left took these human and political questions seriously, then we wouldn't be dealing with the problem of populism in the way we're dealing with it. Secondly, there's a wonderful piece in the last issue of Commentary by Daniel Pipes where he argues that responsible conservatives ought to welcome but aim to tutor the civilizational parties in the East because they are not anti-democratic. They have clarity about the civilizational roots of Europe, including Christianity, and they show much more seriousness and realism about the illiberal tendencies of political Islam than the bien-pensant thinkers in the heart of Western Europe. And I mention those two because there's examples of there is some good European and American thought about what the alternative to a humanitarian Europe ought to be. And Menand is certainly one of the leaders in that camp, Roger Scruton in England, but also this piece by Daniel Pipes. I was surprised it appeared in Commentary because it showed a great deal of sympathy to people who are like Oberon and the Law and Justice people in Poland who are habitually denounced, even in some libertarian and conservative circles, as semi-fascist.
There's a thinker you talks about in your book, Hungarian Aurel Kolnai, talk about his critique of humanitarianism and sort of
Well,
how he helps
yeah,
us
yeah,
think about,
sure.
yeah.
Yeah, Kolnai was born in Hungary. He was a Jew who converted in the 20s to Roman Catholicism under the influence of reading the writings of G.K. Chesterton in English. He had had an interesting intellectual odyssey, kind of like Orestes Brownson. He had been a socialist, and a humanitarian, and a Freudian, but by the mid-20s he was a Roman Catholic, eventually a conservative. But he first of all was a wonderfully articulate and forceful critic of totalitarianism. He wrote the first critique of National Socialism in the German press in 26. He also studied with Edmund Husserl, so he was a professional phenomenologist, which contributed to his philosophical gifts, his powers of description. But in the middle of World War II, while teaching at Laval, or maybe he was still in Cambridge, Mass., but he later went to University of Laval in Canada, he published an article in the Thomas called The Humanitarian versus the Religious Attitude. And I consider this article to be wonderfully prescient, even prophetic, because Kolnai describes with a phenomenologist's and philosopher's gifts of description exactly what the differences are, the myriad and multiple differences between authentic religion, an authentic religious attitude and ethos, and a humanitarian ethos. And why, in the end, humanitarianism cannot confront evil, cannot give us a cogent argument about why life is good, why it leads to political irresponsibility and worse, in extreme forms even to totalitarianism, and how it imposes. He saw, for example, how in the name of humanity people would make arguments for abortion on demand and euthanasia. And he was writing in 1943. He saw the logic of humanitarian democracy. And I think he saw that it could lead to something like Tocqueville's soft despotism, but also to a harder totalitarian despotism. So that's why I reproduced that essay as an appendix to the book, because I consider it to be the most lucid and penetrating and prescient philosophical discussion of the difference between the authentically religious attitude and this humanitarian substitute.
Thinking about the American experience with humanitarianism, you describe, and I didn't want to be self-indulgent, so I didn't start with Orestes Bronson, but we can end with Orestes Bronson.
I've been itching to talk about him.
Orestes Bronson, very conversant with two thinkers you mentioned at the beginning, sort of the arbiters of humanitarianism, Auguste Comte and Saint-Simon. Bronson knew them well, wrote about them extensively, believed in their ideas. This is an American in the 1830s, 1820s, who is something of a socialist or kind of an agrarian socialist, a humanitarian, someone who believes in this progress of man, progress of the age through science, through a secular Christian ethic. He believes all of these things. Tell us, though, I mean, at one level, we know why he leaves this behind, but what does he start to realize and recognize about humanitarianism that we should take heed of?
Well, I love when he's in his book, The Convert, which discusses his movement from, a sort of liberation theology, secular Christian ethic, a progressivism. He wrote essays in the 1830s on a new understanding of Christianity, but he always made clear this had nothing to do with the divinity of Christ. But he was listening to a Reverend Parker, progressive and partisan of the religion of humanity, giving a talk in Boston in 1842, and he was literally repulsed by the argument. And he realized these had been my arguments. There are many other things that happened, the election of 1840 and his newfound awareness of the problems and vulgarity and potential liberalism of majoritarian democracy, that fit in. He also says in various writings that his conversion to Catholicism in 1844 occurred at the same time as his reading of Aristotle's Politics. So his turn toward political moderation and sobriety went hand in hand with his conversion to the Catholic Church. But I think Brownson is so important, and so important for my book, because he not only limned or sketched a deeply serious and persuasive critique of the religion of humanity, but he had been an ideologist of the religion of humanity for 13 years or so. Yeah. He lived through it and worked through it and repudiated it. And he turned to a Catholicism that in the clearest and most emphatic way defended the sovereignty of God as the precondition for human liberty. You know, he argued that, let's say in his approach to the Declaration of Independence, that it's precisely because we don't own ourselves that we don't have the right to own anyone else. In other words, he saw what was at stake, that if human beings own themselves and there are no limits on our freedom, then that's an invitation to unlimited despotism. Yeah. So, and I should add, as a Catholic, divine sovereignty never meant what it means for Islam, radical voluntarism.
No, I mean, it's interesting, too, with Bronson, I think, that, you know, the common trope of our age is the more religious one becomes, the more dangerous one becomes politically. And yet with Bronson, it's really the exact opposite. It's through a discovery of Christianity in Catholicism that he actually begins to understand what Republican constitutionalism really is. And it's why it's good and why it should be defended, and why those who claim to be its biggest defenders, maybe it's unintentionally so, its biggest enemies.
Yeah, no. Brownson became an exemplary American Republican, precisely as you say, because he was a Catholic. He was a strong believer in self-government, in constitutionalism, and the rule of law. He was a critic, as he put it in an 1873 essay of the democratic principle. But with that, he did not mean self-government or human freedom. He meant the valorization of the human will, that there were no limits on either majority will or human willfulness itself. He was an adamant critic of that. But I should also add, and you bring this out very nicely in your selections in the Brownson anthology you put together for Catholic University America Press, that he was a critic of the obscurantists in the church, the people who did not believe in religious liberty, the people in the Curia who rest content with a vague, quasi-theocratic corporatism or authoritarianism. So Brownson was a friend of human liberty, but he was a friend of human liberty who also saw that radical socialism and radical humanitarianism were new threats to the integrity of Republican government, just as a certain kind of obscurantism and theocracy were such a threat.
Yeah, I mean, his descriptions of the abolitionists, which he refers to as the humanitarians in the American Republic, not only he sees their claims against the South. I mean, Bronson was opposed to slavery, you note that, but he sees their claims against slavery being things they are willing to pursue in unconstitutional ways, which he thinks is very dangerous. And he fears after the end of the Civil War that there will be no sort of limits on what they're able to achieve, and they'll end up.
And he was very prophetic. I mean, I think
I think you can also see his critique of abolitionists. You can see it sort of play out amongst progressives, I think, in a way.
Yeah, and I think it's very easy for a certain kind of reader to open Brownson and be embarrassed that, well, he was against slavery, but he didn't like the radical Republicans and the abolitionists, and he saw a certain fanaticism and a liberalism at work in their writings and activism. But he was right. And by the way, Lincoln, whom Brownson could be ambiguous about, but Lincoln, too, was never an abolitionist because he saw that they were willing to jettison certain goods, rule of law, constitutionalism, gradualism, in order to achieve their end, and to achieve it in ways that may have undermined Republican government or political moderation. So, no, I think that's a good example of Brownson's moderation, that he saw a fanaticism lurking just beneath the surface of the religion of humanity.
It's interesting as well. Bronson saw the Civil War in terms of union and holding the country together, because it was a nation. It was a political entity that could not be dissolved just on the basis of property right interest. And so Bronson sees this, I think, very politically, and in the best sense of that term. And one of the things he met with Abraham Lincoln in the White House, I've read, and where he urged upon him the need for the Emancipation Proclamation, well in advance of when it was actually issued. And Bronson stated it in very political terms, that it would help undermine the South, and you should do this now.
Yeah.
That to me is always very telling about how he approached the politics and how he thought about the Constitution.
No, I think that's absolutely right, and he could be. He's a man who could reason politically, and sometimes he seems to be criticizing Lincoln for inaction, the slowness in which the slaves were emancipated. But then, near the end of the war, I think he's worried about the spirit of abolitionism and radical republicanism bringing something like a humanitarian ethos to the South that would destroy the good features of the South. He certainly wanted a South that repudiated chattel slavery and that gave opportunities to the freed blacks. But Branson's absolutely a fascinating thinker, because, as you note, look at the contemporary church. All the talk is about a world governing authority and a critique of nationalism and a identification of the common good in a very humanitarian way with globalism. But Brownson really saw the nation as the home of the common good, and that in no way undermined an appreciation, a deep and abiding appreciation of the moral law, the natural moral law, which was obligatory on all human beings. And we have all these debates. You're part of them, I'm part of them, about how Catholics ought to, how loyal should we be to the United States? Is the United States still morally estimable? I think Brownson is still our best guide, probably along with Tocqueville, in showing us that the great project to keep together the spirit of liberty and the spirit of religion, it not only remains a great imperative, but it's really the only imperative, because otherwise we succumb to an irresponsible withdrawal from society or an open contempt for a regime of self-government which is still open to change and amelioration and improvement by committed Christians and committed men of goodwill who don't identify liberty with the endless unfolding of moral nihilism.
We've been talking with Daniel Mahoney. He's the author of the new book, The Idol of Our Age, by Encounter Books. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Enjoyed it, Richard.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.